In the autumn of 1887, when Catherine Hartwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Millbrook Valley, Montana, she carried with her a carefully pressed wedding dress, 3 months' worth of correspondence from her intended husband, and the unshakable belief that Jonathan Sinclair was waiting to make her his wife. What she discovered instead would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, duty, and the dangerous secrets that families keep buried in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides surrounding Millbrook Valley like a shroud, and Catherine Hartwell pulled her wool traveling cloak tighter as she gazed out the stagecoach window at her new home. After 6 weeks of bone-rattling travel from Philadelphia, the sight of the small frontier town nestled between towering peaks should have filled her with anticipation. Instead, an inexplicable chill settled in her stomach as the coach rolled down the main thoroughfare. Catherine had memorized every detail from Jonathan Sinclair's letters. The 2-story general store with its distinctive red shutters, the whitewashed church with its bell tower reaching toward the sky, the modest but prosperous homes lining Elm Street, where respectable families had put down roots in this remote corner of Montana territory. Everything appeared exactly as he had described. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong. "First time in Millbrook Valley, miss." The elderly woman seated across from her had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, but her smile seemed strained. "Yes, I'm Catherine Hartwell. I've come to marry Jonathan Sinclair." The words felt strange on her tongue now, though she had practiced them countless times during the long journey west. The woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing her features before she managed another smile. "I see. Well, you'll find Millbrook Valley a fine place to settle down, Miss Hartwell. Very peaceful." Catherine nodded, though she noticed how the woman's gaze flickered away when she mentioned Jonathan's name. Perhaps she was simply imagining things. The stress of travel, the magnitude of what she was about to do, marry a man she knew only through his eloquent letters, it would be natural for her nerves to conjure problems where none existed. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the Millbrook Inn, and Catherine gathered her reticule and small traveling bag. Her trunk, containing her few precious possessions and the wedding dress her mother had worn 25 years earlier, would be delivered later. The driver, a weathered man with tobacco-stained whiskers, helped her down from the coach with unexpected gentleness. "You take care now, miss," he said quietly, his eyes holding the same inexplicable sadness she had noticed in the other passenger's expression. Sometimes this territory can be harder on newcomers than they expect. Before Catherine could ask what he meant, he had climbed back onto his perch and was guiding the horses toward the livery stable. She stood alone on the wooden sidewalk, suddenly, aware of how isolated she felt in this place she was supposed to call home. Millbrook Valley in October was breathtakingly beautiful. The aspen trees that dotted the mountainsides blazed gold and orange against the dark green of the pines, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the town, painting lazy spirals against the pale blue sky. Children played in the street nearby, their laughter echoing off the false fronts of the businesses that lined the main road. It should have been perfect. It should have felt like the beginning of the life she had dreamed of during those lonely months in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress and wondering if she would spend her entire life caring for other people's families instead of having one of her own. At 28, Catherine had resigned herself to spinsterhood until Jonathan's advertisement had appeared in the newspaper, seeking an educated woman of good character to share his life in Montana. His letters had been everything she could have hoped for, thoughtful, well-written, filled with descriptions of the life they would build together. He owned a successful lumber mill on the outskirts of town, he had written. He had built a comfortable house with room for the children they would have. He played chess and enjoyed reading, particularly the works of Charles Dickens and Sir Walter Scott. He attended church regularly and was respected in the community. Most importantly, his letters had revealed a kindness and intelligence that had gradually won her heart. By the time she had made her decision to travel west, Catherine found herself genuinely looking forward to meeting the man who had written such beautiful words about their future together. Now, standing on the threshold of that future, she felt only a growing sense of unease. The Millbrook Inn was a two-story building with a wide front porch and carefully tended flower boxes beneath the windows. Catherine pushed through the front door, causing a small bell to chime her arrival. The interior was warm and welcoming, with polished wood floors and comfortable furniture arranged around a large stone fireplace. A plump woman with graying hair looked up from behind the front desk, her face brightening with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "You must be Miss Hartwell." "I'm Martha Collins, and my husband Henry and I run the inn. We've been expecting you." "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. I hope my room is ready." I had written ahead. Of course. Room 6, overlooking the garden. It's our finest accommodation." Martha Collins bustled around the desk, producing a brass key. "I do hope your journey wasn't too difficult. 6 weeks on the road is quite an undertaking for a young lady traveling alone." "It was certainly an adventure," Catherine replied with a weary smile. "But I'm here safely, and that's what matters. I assume Jonathan, Mr. Sinclair, received word that I would be arriving today." Martha's hands stilled on the guest register, and for a moment the woman seemed frozen. When she looked up, her eyes held a strange mixture of pity and something that might have been fear. "Miss Hartwell, perhaps you should rest from your journey. First, get settled in your room. Have some tea. We can discuss arrangements after you've had time to refresh yourself." "Arrangements?" Catherine's unease deepened. "Mrs. Collins, is something wrong? Has something happened to Jonathan?" The older woman's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she came around the desk and gently took Catherine's arm. "My dear, I think you should sit down." Catherine allowed herself to be guided to one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, though every instinct told her to flee from whatever news was coming. Martha sat across from her, wringing her hands in her lap. "Miss Hartwell, Catherine, I'm afraid there's been a terrible tragedy. Jonathan Sinclair died 3 weeks ago." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin around her, and she gripped the arms of the chair to keep from falling. "Died? But how? He wrote to me just last month, and he seemed perfectly healthy." "It was an accident at the lumber mill. A terrible accident. A load of logs broke free from their chains and—" Martha's voice trailed off, unable to finish the horrible details. Catherine stared at the woman, her mind struggling to process this information. Jonathan was dead. The man whose letters she had treasured, whose future she had traveled across the continent to share, was gone. She was alone in a strange place, with limited funds and no family to return to. "I'm so very sorry, dear," Martha continued softly. "We all liked Jonathan. He was a good man, always ready to help his neighbors. The whole town mourned his passing. But—" Catherine's voice came out as barely a whisper. "But no one sent word. I was already traveling when it happened, but surely someone could have telegraphed ahead." Martha looked uncomfortable. "Well, you see, most folks didn't even know about you. Jonathan was a private man, never mentioned he was corresponding with anyone back east. It wasn't until after the funeral that his brother found your letters among his things." "His brother?" This was news to Catherine. Jonathan had never mentioned having family in the area. "Yes, Daniel Sinclair. He's been managing Jonathan's affairs since the accident. The mill, the house, settling debts." Martha hesitated. "He's the one who asked us to look after you when you arrived. He's been quite concerned about your situation." Catherine felt a spark of hope amid her grief and confusion. "He's been concerned about me. Does that mean... would he be able to help me arrange passage back east? I'm afraid my funds are rather limited, and with Jonathan gone... Actually," a deep voice said from behind her, "I was hoping we could discuss other options." Catherine turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway of the inn. He was removing his hat, revealing dark hair and features that made her heart skip a beat. He looked exactly like Jonathan, or at least exactly like the photograph Jonathan had sent with his third letter. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same tall, lean build. But this wasn't Jonathan. Jonathan was dead. "You must be Catherine Hartwell," the man said, approaching with long, confident strides. "I'm Daniel Sinclair, Jonathan's twin brother." Twin brother, of course. The resemblance was so complete that for a moment Catherine had felt as if she were seeing a ghost. Daniel extended his hand, and she took it numbly, noting that his grip was firm and warm. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Sinclair, and thank you for your concern regarding my situation. I realize this must be difficult for you as well." Daniel's dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made Catherine feel self-conscious about her travel-worn appearance. "Actually, Miss Hartwell, I've been giving your situation considerable thought since I found your letters among Jonathan's possessions. I believe there may be a solution that would benefit both of us." "I'm afraid I don't understand." Daniel glanced at Martha, who took the hint and excused herself to attend to other guests. When they were alone, he took the seat Martha had vacated, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Miss Hartwell, Catherine, may I speak plainly?" She nodded, though something in his manner made her nervous. "Jonathan entered into a binding agreement with you. Marriage may be more than a legal contract, but it is certainly that much. He made promises, created expectations, and induced you to uproot your entire life based on those promises." "Yes, but surely his death releases both parties from any obligation." "Does it?" Daniel interrupted gently. "You've traveled 6 weeks to get here. You've given up your position in Philadelphia, sold your possessions, spent your savings on the journey. Through no fault of your own, you find yourself stranded in a place where you know no one, with barely enough money to survive, let alone return to your former life." Catherine stared at him, unsure where this conversation was leading. "That's all true, but I don't see how... What if the contract could still be honored?" The words hung in the air between them. Catherine was certain she had misunderstood. "I beg your pardon?" Daniel straightened in his chair, his expression serious but not unkind. "Jonathan and I were identical twins, Miss Hartwell. We shared everything, growing up. Clothes, friends, sometimes even sweethearts who couldn't tell us apart. We built the lumber mill together, lived in the same house, planned our futures side by side." His voice dropped slightly. "Reading your correspondence with him, I found myself agreeing with every plan he made, every dream he shared with you. In many ways, his letters could have been mine." Catherine felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Mr. Sinclair, surely you're not suggesting... I'm suggesting that I honor my brother's commitment, that I marry you as he intended to do, that I provide you with the home and security he promised." The proposition was so unexpected, so outrageous, that Catherine could only stare at him in shocked silence. Marry Jonathan's twin brother? A man she had just met? It was impossible, improper, completely beyond consideration, and yet... "Why would you make such an offer?" she heard herself asking. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of sadness that resonated with her own grief. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jonathan was my other half, Miss Hartwell. We came into this world together, and I never imagined I would have to navigate it without him." He looked at her directly, and she saw genuine pain in his dark eyes. "He spent months writing to you, sharing his hopes and dreams for the life you would build together. In many ways, you were the last person to know the real Jonathan, the man he was becoming as he prepared for marriage." Catherine felt tears threatening, both for her own loss and for this man's obvious grief. "I realize this must sound like the ravings of a grief-stricken man," Daniel continued. "But in the week since Jonathan's death, I found myself thinking about the plans he made, the future he envisioned. Perhaps it's selfish, but I find comfort in the idea of carrying out his intentions, of ensuring that his death doesn't also destroy the happiness he was trying to create. But marriage is more than just fulfilling a contract," Catherine protested weakly. "There should be affection, compatibility, shared values." "And how do you know we don't share those things?" Daniel asked quietly. "You fell in love with Jonathan through his letters, through his thoughts and dreams and plans for the future. I shared all of those thoughts, those dreams, the man you've been corresponding with for months, his heart, his mind, his values. That man is as much me as he was Jonathan." Catherine's head was spinning. The proposal was madness, and yet there was a strange logic to it that she couldn't entirely dismiss. She had indeed fallen in love with the man revealed in those letters, the intelligence and kindness and gentle humor that had shone through his words. If Daniel was truly Jonathan's twin in more than just appearance. "I need time to think," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "Of course, this has been a shock for you, losing Jonathan, and then hearing such an unexpected proposal. Take all the time you need. I've arranged for your accommodations here at the inn for as long as necessary." "That's very generous, but I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Daniel said firmly. "It's my responsibility. Jonathan made a commitment to you, and that commitment doesn't die with him. Whether you ultimately accept my proposal or not, I intend to ensure you have the means to decide your future freely, without the pressure of financial desperation." Catherine studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found only sincerity and a sadness that matched her own. "There's something else you should know," Daniel said, rising from his chair. "The house Jonathan built, our house, was designed with you in mind. Every room, every detail was planned according to the things you mentioned in your letters. Your love of reading, your skill with needlework, your desire for a garden. In a very real sense, it's already your home. It's been waiting for you. With that, he placed his hat back on his head and moved toward the door. "I'll call on you tomorrow evening, if that's agreeable. That will give you time to rest and consider what I've said." Catherine nodded mutely, still trying to process everything that had happened in the space of an hour. This morning she had been a bride-to-be, traveling to meet her intended husband. Now she was a widow before she had ever been a wife, being courted by a man who was a stranger and yet somehow familiar. "Mr. Sinclair," she called as he reached the door. He turned back to her. "The accident that killed Jonathan. Do you know exactly what happened?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment she thought she saw something other than grief in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, or suspicion. A load of logs broke loose from their chains while Jonathan was inspecting a shipment. He was crushed before anyone could reach him. Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless. "It was ruled an accident by the sheriff. These things happen at lumber mills, but you have doubts?" Daniel studied her for a long moment. "Jonathan was the most careful man I knew when it came to mill safety. He inspected those chains personally every morning. For them to fail so catastrophically," he shrugged. "Perhaps grief is making me see conspiracies where none exist. Good evening, Miss Hartwell." After he left, Catherine sat alone by the fire, her mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Jonathan was dead. possibly not by accident. His twin brother had proposed marriage to honor a contract made with a dead man, and somewhere in this small mountain town, she was supposed to make a decision that would determine the course of her entire life. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Catherine watched the light fade and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in coming so far from everything familiar and safe. But then she thought of Philadelphia, of the cramped boarding house where she had lived, the endless hours of sewing for demanding customers, the prospect of growing old alone with nothing to show for her life but a handful of saved coins and fading eyesight. At least here, in this beautiful and dangerous place, she had choices to make. And perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, she might find something worth all the risks she was taking. As darkness settled over Millbrook Valley, Catherine Hartwell sat by the fire and began to plan her future, unaware that forces beyond her understanding were already shaping that future in ways she could not imagine. Catherine woke before dawn, her sleep fractured by dreams of a man with Jonathan's face who spoke in riddles about broken chains and promises that transcended death. Through the thin walls of the inn, she could hear the sounds of a town stirring to life. Horses being led to water, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, voices calling morning greetings across the dusty street. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and arranged her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style. If she was going to navigate this impossible situation, she would do so with dignity and tact. The woman who stared back at her from the small mirror looked pale and uncertain, but determined. Breakfast in the inn's dining room proved to be an education in small-town dynamics. Martha Collins introduced her to the other guests, a traveling salesman named Porter who dealt in farm equipment, an elderly couple heading to visit their son in Helena, and a mysterious woman in expensive black clothing who gave only her surname, Mrs. Whitmore, and claimed to be passing through on business. "Miss Hartwell is our newest resident," Martha announced cheerfully as she served thick slices of bacon and fluffy biscuits. "She's come all the way from Philadelphia." Porter, a gregarious man with a handlebar mustache, leaned forward with interest. "Philadelphia? That's quite a journey, miss. What brings you to our little corner of paradise?" Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. How did one explain traveling across the continent to marry a dead man? "I came to join a friend," she said. "Carefully, but circumstances have changed." Mrs. Whitmore, who had been eating her breakfast in silence, looked up sharply at this. Her pale blue eyes seemed to assess Catherine with calculating precision before returning to her plate. There was something unsettling about the woman's attention, though Catherine couldn't pinpoint why. "Well, you've certainly picked a beautiful place to visit," the elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, said kindly. "Though I do hope you're not planning to stay through winter. These mountain winters can be harsh for those not accustomed to them." "I haven't decided on my plans yet," Catherine replied truthfully. Porter launched into a detailed account of his travels throughout Montana Territory, regaling the table with stories of mining camps and cattle ranches, boom towns that appeared overnight and disappeared just as quickly. Catherine found herself only half listening, her attention drawn repeatedly to Mrs. Whitmore, who seemed to be taking particular interest in every word she spoke. After breakfast, Catherine decided to explore Millbrook Valley properly. She needed to understand this place where Jonathan had chosen to build his life and where she might potentially build hers. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of water rushing over rocks. Main Street was busier than she had expected for such a remote location. Wagons loaded with lumber rumbled past, heading toward what she assumed was the railroad depot. Men in work clothes nodded politely as they passed, and several women paused in their errands to offer shy smiles and curious glances at the stranger in their midst. The first stop on her informal tour was Brennan's General Store, a large establishment that seemed to stock everything from bolts of fabric to mining supplies. The proprietor, a thin man with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes, looked up from his ledger as she entered. "You must be Miss Hartwell," he said, coming around the counter to offer his hand. "I'm Patrick Brennan. Welcome to Millbrook Valley." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I'm hoping to get better acquainted with the town. I understand this is quite a thriving community." Patrick's expression grew cautious. "Thriving, yes, though we've had our share of troubles lately." He glanced around the store as if checking for eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice. "I suppose you know about poor Jonathan Sinclair?" "Yes, his brother told me about the accident. It must have been a terrible shock for everyone who knew him." "Accident." Patrick repeated the word with a slight emphasis that made Catherine's pulse quicken. "Yes, that's what Sheriff Morrison ruled. Jonathan was always careful around the mill machinery, mind you. Never took shortcuts when it came to safety. But accidents happen, I suppose." There was clearly more he wanted to say, but the shop door opened with a cheerful chime, admitting two women in their 30s who greeted Patrick warmly before turning curious eyes to Catherine. "Ladies, this is Miss Catherine Hartwell, visiting us from Philadelphia. Miss Hartwell, may I present Mrs. Sarah Morrison, her husband is our sheriff, and Miss Lucy Fletcher, who teaches at our school." Both women were friendly and welcoming, though Catherine sensed the same undercurrent of speculation she had noticed in others. News of the mail-order bride arrangement had clearly spread through the community, despite Martha's assurance that few people had known of Jonathan's correspondence. "How lovely to meet you," Sarah Morrison said warmly. "I do hope you'll find Millbrook Valley to your liking. We have such a strong community here, always looking out for one another." Lucy Fletcher, a petite woman with intelligent brown eyes, tilted her head curiously. "Have you had a chance to visit the mill yet? It's quite an impressive operation. The Sinclair brothers built it from nothing, you know, though I suppose now it's just Daniel running things." "I haven't visited yet," Catherine replied. "Though I understand it's where the accident occurred. It must be difficult for Mr. Daniel Sinclair to continue working there." The three local residents exchanged glances that Catherine couldn't interpret. Finally, Sarah spoke carefully. "Daniel is a strong man. He's always been the more practical of the two brothers. Jonathan was the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities in everything. Daniel is the one who makes those possibilities real." There was something in her tone that suggested more complexity to the brothers' relationship than simple complementary differences. Catherine filed the observation away for later consideration. After purchasing a few necessities and accepting directions to other establishments, Catherine continued her exploration. The town was laid out in a sensible grid, with residential streets branching off from the commercial main thoroughfare. Many of the homes were modest but well-maintained, with neat gardens and carefully painted fences that spoke of civic pride. It was while walking down Elm Street that Catherine encountered her first direct glimpse into the life Jonathan had planned for them. The house stood at the end of the street, set back from the road on a generous lot that offered both privacy and views of the surrounding mountains. It was exactly as he had described in his letters: 2 stories of white-painted wood with green shutters, a wraparound porch, and dormered windows that seemed to watch the street like friendly eyes. A woman was working in the front garden, pulling the last of the season's vegetables. She looked up as Catherine approached, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "You must be Catherine Hartwell," the woman said, straightening and wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with streaks of silver in her brown hair, and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. "I'm Rose McKenna. I've been looking after the house since the accident." "Mrs. McKenna. It's kind of you to maintain the property." Rose studied Catherine with frank curiosity. "Daniel asked me to keep things tidy, in case, Well, in case you decided to stay. Would you like to see inside? Catherine's heart hammered as she followed Rose up the front steps. This was the home Jonathan had built for her, the physical manifestation of all the dreams they had shared through their letters. Stepping inside felt like entering a sacred space, one that held the ghost of possibilities that would never be realized. The interior was beautifully appointed but unmistakably masculine. Dark wood furniture, sturdy and well-crafted. Bookshelves lined one wall of the sitting room, filled with volumes that Catherine recognized from Jonathan's letters. Dickens, Scott, Shakespeare, and numerous technical books about forestry and mill operations. A chess set sat on a small table near the window, the pieces arranged mid-game, as if waiting for players who would never return. He spent hours planning every detail, Rose said quietly, watching Catherine's reaction. Jonathan was so excited about your arrival. He must have rearranged the furniture in the parlor a dozen times, trying to decide what you'd prefer. Catherine traced her fingers along the mantelpiece, where a daguerreotype showed two identical young men standing side by side. They couldn't have been more than 20 when the photograph was taken, but she could clearly see the differences Rose and others had mentioned. Jonathan's expression was open and optimistic, his eyes bright with dreams. Daniel's face was more guarded, his stance suggesting readiness for whatever challenges might come. They were very different, weren't they? She asked. Rose nodded slowly. Like two sides of the same coin. Jonathan saw the best in everyone, believed in possibilities that seemed impossible. Daniel... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Daniel has seen more of the world's harsh realities. He's protective of those he cares about, sometimes. To a fault. What do you mean by that? Rose hesitated, glancing around as if checking for listeners. There are things about Jonathan's death that don't sit right with some folks in town. Daniel has been asking questions, making certain people uncomfortable. What kind of questions? Before Rose could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Through the front window, Catherine could see a rider approaching at considerable speed. Rose's face paled as she recognized the horseman. That's Tom Bradley, one of the mill workers, she said urgently. Something must be wrong. They rushed onto the front porch as Bradley pulled his horse to a stop, the animal lathered with sweat from hard riding. The man himself looked equally distressed, his face flushed and his eyes wide with excitement or fear. Mrs. McKenna, is Daniel here? I need to find Daniel right away. He's not here, Tom. What happened? Bradley noticed Catherine for the first time, his expression growing uncertain. Udry, it's a mill business, ma'am. Nothing for outsiders to worry about. Rose stepped forward firmly. Tom Bradley, this is Catherine Hartwell. She has every right to know what's happening, especially if it concerns the mill where Jonathan died. Now tell us what's got you so worked up. Bradley looked between the two women, clearly torn between discretion and urgency. Finally, urgency won. We found something in the equipment shed, hidden under some old lumber that hasn't been moved since. Before Jonathan's accident, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a length of chain, holding it up so they could see. This was supposed to be on the crane that killed Jonathan. Look at it. Catherine gasped as she saw what he meant. Several links of the chain showed obvious signs of tampering, fine saw marks where the metal had been deliberately weakened. Someone had sabotaged the equipment, ensuring it would fail under load. Jonathan didn't die in an accident, Bradley said grimly. He was murdered. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She sank onto the porch steps, her mind racing with the implications. Jonathan hadn't simply died in an industrial accident, he had been deliberately killed. But why? And by whom? Rose sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Are you certain about this, Tom? Clear as day, someone wanted that chain to break, and they wanted it to happen when Jonathan was underneath that load of logs. Bradley's voice was tight with anger. Question is, who had access to the equipment and who wanted Jonathan dead badly enough to plan something this cold-blooded? Catherine found her voice. Where is Daniel? He needs to know about this immediately. That's what I'm trying to figure out, Bradley replied. He left the mill early this morning, said he had business in town. But I've checked everywhere, the bank, the telegraph office, the inn. Nobody's seen him. A chill ran down Catherine's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How long has he been missing? Since dawn, and there's something else. Bradley lowered his voice, glancing around nervously. Before Jonathan died, he was asking questions about some land deals that didn't make sense, property changing hands, for prices that seemed too good to be true. Daniel thinks someone was pressuring landowners to sell cheap, then reselling to outside investors for huge profits. Rose frowned. What does that have to do with the mill? Maybe everything. The Sinclair mill sits on some of the most valuable timberland in the valley. If someone wanted to control the entire lumber trade in this area, they'd need to eliminate the competition. Bradley's expression was grim. Jonathan might have discovered who was behind the land scheme. That discovery might have gotten him killed. Catherine stood up abruptly, her decision made. We need to find Daniel. If he's investigating the same things that got Jonathan murdered, he could be in danger. Miss Hartwell, with respect, this isn't your concern, Bradley said. This is dangerous business for folks who don't understand the territory. It became my concern the moment someone murdered the man I came here to marry, Catherine replied, with more steel in her voice than she had known she possessed. And it's certainly my concern if Daniel Sinclair is in danger because he's trying to find his brother's killer. Rose looked at her with new respect. What do you propose we do? Catherine considered their options. A missing man, evidence of murder, and a conspiracy that might involve land fraud and intimidation. In Philadelphia, she would have gone straight to the police. But here, in this remote valley, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, things were clearly more complicated. First, we need to tell Sheriff Morrison about the chain. Whatever else is happening, we have proof that Jonathan was murdered. The law needs to know. Bradley looked skeptical. Morrison's a good man, but he's not equipped to handle something this big. He's got no deputies, and if this conspiracy involves people with money and influence, then we make sure he has help, Catherine said firmly. Isn't there a territorial marshal who can be contacted? Federal authorities who handle crimes that cross county lines? There's Marshal Hayes in Helena, Rose said slowly. He's investigated corruption cases before, but it would take days to get word to him and have him travel here. Then we start with Sheriff Morrison and see what he advises. But first, we find Daniel. Catherine looked between her companions. You know this area better than I do. Where would he go if he wanted to investigate quietly? Where might he look for evidence about these land deals? Bradley and Rose exchanged glances. Finally, Rose spoke. There's an old prospector named Jake Holloway who lives up in the hills. He's been in this valley longer than anyone, seen all the changes over the years. If anyone would know about suspicious land transactions, it would be Jake, and he's one of the few people who isn't afraid to speak his mind about powerful folks. How do we get to him? It's a hard ride, especially for someone not used to mountain trails, Bradley warned. 3 hours at least, and the path isn't easy to follow. Catherine straightened her shoulders. Then you'll have to guide me. And we'll need to leave immediately if Daniel is already in trouble. As they prepared to leave the house, Catherine caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The reflection showed a woman transformed from the uncertain bride who had arrived just yesterday. Her eyes held determination instead of confusion, and her posture spoke of someone ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. She was no longer simply reacting to circumstances beyond her control. She was choosing to act, to seek answers, to protect. A man who had offered to protect her Whether that made her brave or foolish remained to be seen, but she was committed to the course now. The last thing she noticed as they left the house was the chess game still waiting on its table, pieces frozen in an eternal struggle between opposing forces. Soon, she suspected, she would learn which side she was truly on and what price would be demanded for victory. The mountains loomed ahead, hiding their secrets in shadow and mist. Somewhere among those peaks, Daniel Sinclair was either finding answers or walking into a trap. Catherine could only hope they would reach him in time to make a difference. As Rose saddled horses and Bradley gathered supplies for the journey, Catherine felt the weight of Jonathan's wedding ring on the chain around her neck. She had come west to honor one man's dreams of the future. Now, she found herself fighting to preserve another man's life, driven by emotions she didn't fully understand and a sense of justice that burned brighter than her fear. The mail order, bride from Philadelphia, was about to become something she had never imagined. A woman willing to ride into danger for the sake of truth, and perhaps for love of a different kind than she had originally sought. The mountain trail wound upward, through dense stands of pine and aspen, their autumn leaves creating a canopy of gold and crimson above the narrow path. Catherine's borrowed horse, a steady mare named Buttercup, picked her way carefully over loose rocks and exposed roots while Catherine fought to maintain her balance in the unfamiliar side saddle. Behind her, Tom Bradley led a pack horse loaded with supplies, his weathered face creased with worry as he scanned the surrounding forest for any sign of Daniel Sinclair. They had been climbing for nearly 2 hours when Bradley called for a rest. Beside a small creek that tumbled down from higher elevations, Catherine gratefully dismounted, her legs trembling from the unaccustomed exertion of mountain riding. The silence of the wilderness was broken only by the sound of rushing water and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. "We're about halfway to Jake Holloway's place," Bradley announced, checking the position of the sun through the tree canopy. "But I have to tell you, Miss Hartwell, I'm starting to worry we might be on a fool's errand. If Daniel came up here this morning, he should have reached Jake's cabin hours ago and been back by now." Catherine knelt beside the creek and splashed cold water on her face, the shock of it helping to clear her mind. Perhaps Mr. Holloway had information that required Daniel to travel elsewhere. Or maybe the trail was harder than expected. Maybe. Bradley's tone suggested he didn't find those explanations convincing. But Daniel knows these mountains better than most. He and Jonathan used to hunt up here when they were boys. Nothing should have delayed him this long. A new voice spoke from the trees behind them, causing both Catherine and Bradley to spin around in alarm. Unless he ran into trouble he wasn't expecting, a man emerged from the forest with the silent grace of someone accustomed to moving undetected. He was perhaps 60 years old, with long grey hair tied back and clothing that looked like it had been assembled from whatever materials came to hand: buckskin pants, a wool shirt that had seen better days, and boots that were practical rather than fashionable. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent as they assessed the two travelers. "Jake Holloway, I presume," Catherine said, recovering her composure more quickly than she would have thought possible. "That's right, miss, and you must be the lady from back east that's got everyone in town talking." Holloway stepped closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "Tom Bradley, good to see you, though I wish the circumstances were better." Bradley relaxed slightly at the familiar greeting. "Jake, we're looking for Daniel Sinclair. He left town this morning, and we thought he might be heading up to see you." Holloway's expression grew serious. "He was here all right. Arrived around noon with a head full of questions and a mood darker than a thundercloud. But he didn't stay. Long once I told him what I knew." Catherine felt her heart sink. "What did you tell him?" The old prospector looked between them, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Maybe we should head back to my cabin before we start sharing secrets. These mountains have ears, and not all of them belong to friendly folks." Holloway's cabin was a sturdy structure built into a natural clearing that offered commanding views of the valley below. It was surrounded by the accumulated possessions of a man who had spent decades living off the land: stacks of firewood, animal pelts stretched on frames, and various tools and contraptions whose purposes Catherine could only guess at. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books, maps, and specimen jars. "Sit yourselves down," Holloway said, gesturing to chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. "I'll make some coffee and then I'll tell you what I told Daniel this afternoon." As the coffee brewed, Holloway spread a large, hand-drawn map across his wooden table. Catherine could see that it showed the entire Millbrook Valley region in remarkable detail, with property boundaries, water sources, and elevation markers all carefully noted. "I've been keeping track of land transactions in this valley for the past 5 years," Holloway began, pointing to various sections of the map. "Started out as idle curiosity. When you live alone up here, you notice when neighbors change. But patterns started emerging that didn't make sense." He traced a finger across several parcels of land, all marked with red ink. "These properties have all changed hands in the past 2 years. Small ranches mostly, some timber claims, a few mining operations that weren't paying out. Nothing suspicious about that except for 2 things. "Which are?" Catherine asked, leaning forward to study the map. "First, they were all purchased by the same buyer, a company called Mountain Development Corporation that nobody in town had ever heard of before. Second, the prices were uniformly low, not just fair market value, but significantly below what the land should have been worth." Bradley frowned. "Maybe the sellers were just desperate to get out. Ranching up here isn't easy, and mining is always a gamble." "That's what I thought at first," Holloway agreed. "But then I started talking to some of the folks who sold. Not all of them were eager to leave. In fact, several told me they'd been pressured to sell. Visits from men who suggested it would be healthier for them and their families if they took the offer and moved on." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Intimidation. Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Holloway pointed to a cluster of properties near the center of the map. "Look at the pattern of acquisitions. They form almost a complete circle around the most valuable timber and mineral rights in the valley. The only major holdouts were the Sinclair Mill and 3 other properties." Catherine studied the map, seeing the strategic nature of the land grab for the first time. Someone was trying to corner the market on natural resources. More than that, Holloway said grimly, they were positioning themselves to control access to the railroad when it comes through. All freight, all lumber, all mining output would have to go through land they owned. They could charge whatever they wanted for access. "Rights." Bradley let out a low whistle. "That would be worth a fortune, but you said there were holdouts?" Holloway nodded, his expression growing darker. "The Steinberg Ranch sold 3 months ago, after their barn mysteriously burned down and their cattle started dying of a sickness that didn't affect neighboring herds. The Patterson mining claim changed hands 6 weeks ago, right after Patterson had what the doctor called a riding accident, though Patterson swore his horse had been spooked by something that shouldn't have been there." "And the third holdout?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Old Henrik Müller, stubborn German immigrant who owned the best water rights in the valley. Mountain Development made him increasingly generous offers, all of which he refused." Holloway's voice dropped. "Muller was found dead in his cabin 2 months ago. Natural causes, according to Doc Peterson. Heart failure brought on by age and hard living." Catherine felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "But you don't believe that. Muller was 73, but strong as an ox. I saw him just a week before he died, splitting firewood like a man half his age. His heart was fine." Holloway pointed to Muller's property on the map, now marked with the same red ink as the others. "His property sold at auction 4 days. After his funeral, Guess who the only bidder was? The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Catherine stared at the map, seeing not just land transactions, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror and murder designed to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of someone's grand design for the valley. Jonathan must have discovered this pattern, she said finally. That's why he was killed. That's what Daniel thinks too, Holloway confirmed. He came up here with some of the same questions, but he had additional information I didn't. Apparently, Jonathan had been keeping records of his own, documenting the pressure tactics and suspicious deaths. Daniel found those records after the funeral. Bradley leaned forward intently. What kind of records? Names, dates, details of conversations Jonathan had with some of the intimidated landowners. Evidence that Mountain Development Corporation is just a front for someone local, someone with enough influence to control the sheriff's investigations and the doctor's medical opinions. Catherine's blood ran cold. Did he discover who's behind it? Holloway's expression grew troubled. That's where things get dangerous, miss. Daniel thinks he knows, but he needed more evidence before making accusations against someone with that, a kind of power. That's why he left here in such a hurry. Where did he go? Back to town, but not directly. He was planning to stop at the Mueller cabin first, see if he could find anything the authorities missed. Then he wanted to check some land records at the county office before it closed. Bradley stood up abruptly. Jake, that's not good. If Daniel is right about who's behind this conspiracy, walking into the county office with questions about land, fraud would be like painting a target on his back. I know. Holloway's weathered face was creased with worry. I tried to talk him out of it, told him to wait until he could get federal authorities involved. But Daniel has his brother's stubborn streak when it comes to doing what he thinks is right. Catherine rose from her chair, decision crystallizing in her mind. We have to warn him. If he's walking into a trap... Miss Hartwell, with respect, we don't even know where he is right now, Bradley interrupted. He could be at the Mueller cabin. He could be in town. He could be anywhere in between. And if the people behind this conspiracy realize we're onto them, we could all end up like Jonathan and Mueller. Then what do you suggest we do? Sit here and hope for the best while Daniel puts himself in danger trying to solve his brother's murder? Holloway studied her for a long moment, and Catherine had the sense she was being evaluated for qualities she didn't know she possessed. There might be another way, he said finally. Someone we could contact who has the authority to investigate this properly and who isn't beholden to local interests. The territorial marshal in Helena? No. Someone closer. Judge William Harrison is conducting court sessions in Butte this week. He's got a reputation for being honest and for not tolerating corruption in his jurisdiction. If we could get word to him, along with copies of the evidence Daniel has gathered. Bradley nodded, slowly. Harrison would have the authority to order a federal investigation, maybe even send in federal marshals to make arrests. But how do we contact him? And how do we get him the evidence without alerting the conspirators? Holloway moved to a chest in the corner of his cabin and withdrew a small leather satchel. I may live like a hermit, but I'm not completely cut off from civilization. I've got contacts in Butte, people who owe me favors from the old days. One of them could get a message. To Judge Harrison quickly and discreetly. Catherine felt a spark of hope. What would you need from us? Everything Daniel told you about Jonathan's records, everything you've observed since arriving in town. Names, dates, suspicious behavior, anything that might help Harrison understand the scope of what we're dealing with. As Catherine and Bradley recounted their experiences, Holloway took careful notes in a small journal. The process of organizing the information revealed just how comprehensive the conspiracy appeared to be. The timing of deaths and property sales, the pattern of intimidation, the involvement of local officials in covering up evidence, it painted a picture of corruption that reached deep into the valley's power structure. There's something else, Catherine said as they neared the end of their account. Mrs. Whitmore, the woman staying at the inn. She's been paying particular attention to everything I say and do. It might be coincidence, but Holloway looked up sharply from his notes. Describe her. Middle-aged, expensively dressed, pale blue eyes. She claims to be passing through on business, but she seems very interested in local affairs for a casual traveler. That's no casual traveler, Holloway said grimly. That's Margaret Whitmore, and she works for some very powerful people back east. If she's in Millbrook Valley, it's because the conspiracy is moving into its final phases. Bradley frowned. What do you mean? Whitmore specializes in what you might call problem resolution for investors who don't like to get their hands dirty. If she's here, it means someone is getting impatient with the remaining obstacles to their plan. Holloway's expression was grim, including Daniel Sinclair and anyone else who might cause trouble. The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. We have to warn him now. Agreed, but we also have to be smart about it. Holloway moved to his window and peered down at the valley below. It'll be dark soon. That gives us some advantages, but also some dangers. These people have shown they're willing to kill to protect their interests. Catherine checked the small pistol Rose McKenna had insisted she carry, making sure it was loaded and easily accessible. The weight of it in her pocket was both reassuring and terrifying, a reminder that she was now part of a conflict that had already claimed lives and would likely claim more before it was resolved. I have an idea, she said suddenly. What if we split up? Tom, you could ride back to town and try to find Daniel, warn him about Mrs. Whitmore and the immediate danger. Mr. Holloway, you could dispatch your message to Judge Harrison in Butte, and you could stay here where it's safe. Bradley interrupted firmly. Catherine shook her head. I could return to the inn and keep watch on Mrs. Whitmore. If she's planning something, I might be able to overhear details or warn potential targets. Absolutely not, Bradley said. That woman is dangerous, and you'd be walking right into her hands. She doesn't know that I suspect anything. As far as she's concerned, I'm just a confused mail-order bride trying to figure out what to do with my life. I might be able to learn something useful. Holloway considered this. It's risky, but it might work. Whitmore is used to people underestimating her because she's a woman. She might not be as careful around someone she sees as harmless. I am not letting Miss Hartwell put herself in that kind of danger, Bradley stated flatly. Catherine turned to face him, surprised by her own calm determination. Mr. Bradley, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your decision to make. I came to this valley to build a life with Jonathan Sinclair. He's dead because someone wanted to steal everything he had worked for. I may not be able to bring him back, but I can help make sure his killers don't succeed. The two men looked at her with expressions that mixed respect, concern, and resignation. Finally, Holloway spoke. If you're determined to do this, we need to give you some advantages. Information about Whitmore, signals you can use to communicate with us, escape routes in case things go wrong. As darkness fell over the mountains, the three conspirators planned their strategy with the careful attention to detail that their lives might depend on. Catherine found herself thinking of the chess game in Jonathan's parlor, pieces positioned for a battle between opposing forces. Now she was one of those pieces, choosing which side of the board to occupy and what moves to make in a game where the stakes couldn't be higher. Tomorrow would bring revelations, confrontations, and perhaps the resolution of mysteries that had already cost too many lives. As Catherine prepared to ride back down the mountain trail toward an uncertain fate, she carried with her not just evidence of a murder conspiracy, but a newfound understanding of her own capacity for courage in the face of danger. The mail-order bride who had arrived seeking security and companionship was becoming someone else entirely, a woman willing to risk everything for justice and perhaps for a love that had grown from shared danger and mutual respect. Whether that transformation would save Daniel Sinclair or cost them both their lives remained to be seen. Catherine's descent from the mountains in the gathering darkness required all her concentration. The borrowed mare picked her way carefully down the treacherous trail, but Catherine's mind was elsewhere, focused on the dangerous game she was about to play with Margaret Whitmore. By the time she reached the outskirts of Millbrook Valley, oil lamps were flickering to life in windows throughout the town, creating pools of warm light against the encroaching night. She left Buttercup at the livery stable with instructions for the mare's care, then made her way to the Millbrook Inn through back streets, hoping to avoid notice. The fewer people who knew about her mountain expedition, the better. As she approached the inn's rear entrance, she caught sight of a familiar figure silhouetted against the dining room window, Margaret Whitmore, seated alone at a table, writing in what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Catherine slipped through the kitchen door, nodding to the cook who was cleaning up after the evening meal. The woman looked surprised to see her, but said nothing as Catherine hurried through the back hallway toward the main stairs. She needed to change clothes and compose herself before facing Whitmore, needed to appear like nothing more than a weary traveler returning from a day of exploring the town. In her room, Catherine quickly exchanged her riding clothes for a simple evening dress, pinned her windblown hair into a respectable arrangement, and splashed water on her face to remove the dust of travel. The face that stared back at her from the small mirror showed no trace of the fear that churned in her stomach. Good. If she was going to spy on a professional killer, she would need every advantage surprise could offer. The dining room was nearly empty when Catherine entered, claiming a table that offered a clear view of Whitmore while appearing to focus on her own meal. The mysterious woman looked up briefly when Catherine appeared, offering a polite nod before returning to her writing. Up close, Catherine could see that Whitmore's journal was filled with neat columns of figures and what appeared to be coded notations. Miss Hartwell. Martha Collins approached with a steaming plate of roast beef and potatoes. I was beginning to worry when you didn't return for dinner. I hope you had a pleasant day exploring our valley. Very educational, thank you. Catherine kept her voice light and casual. I visited the house where Jonathan had planned for us to live. It's quite beautiful, though seeing it made his loss feel more real somehow. She was acutely aware that Whitmore was listening to every word, though the woman gave no obvious sign of attention. Catherine continued her performance of the grieving mail-order bride, allowing just the right note of uncertainty to creep into her voice. I'm finding myself quite torn about what to do. Mr. Daniel Sinclair has been very kind, but staying here feels presumptuous, and returning east seems like admitting defeat. Martha's expression softened with genuine sympathy. These are difficult decisions, dear. Perhaps time will make things clearer. After Martha left, Catherine ate slowly, keeping her attention apparently focused on her meal while actually observing Whitmore's behavior. The woman wrote steadily for nearly an hour, occasionally pausing to consult a small timepiece. At precisely 9 o'clock, she closed the journal, rose from her table, and moved toward the inn's front entrance. Catherine waited several minutes before following, claiming she needed fresh air after the day's exertions. Outside, she could see Whitmore walking purposefully down Main Street toward the commercial district. Catherine kept to the shadows, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while staying close enough to observe. Whitmore stopped at the back entrance of what Catherine recognized as the bank building. A soft knock brought the door open immediately, suggesting the meeting had been arranged in advance. Light spilled out briefly as Whitmore entered, then the door closed, leaving Catherine alone in the darkness. The bank. Catherine felt pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place with sickening clarity. Whoever was behind the Mountain Development Corporation had to have access to financing, property records, and the legal mechanisms needed to transfer ownership of dozens of parcels of land. A bank would be the perfect cover for such operations. Moving. Carefully to avoid detection, Catherine circled the building until she found a window that offered a view into what appeared to be a private office. Heavy curtains blocked most of the interior, but a gap between the panels allowed her to see three figures seated around a desk. Whitmore, a heavy-set man Catherine didn't recognize, and someone whose identity made her blood run cold. Sheriff Morrison. The sheriff was part of the conspiracy, the man responsible for investigating suspicious deaths and accidents was working with the people causing them. Catherine pressed closer to the window, straining to hear conversation through the glass. "Won't wait much longer," Whitmore was saying, her cultured voice carrying clearly in the still air. "My employers expected this matter to be resolved. Weeks ago, Jonathan Sinclair's death should have eliminated the primary obstacle." The heavy-set man, whom Catherine now assumed was the bank president, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We couldn't have anticipated his brother becoming so persistent. Daniel has always been the more cautious of the two, more willing to compromise." "Caution and persistence are not the same thing," Whitmore replied coldly. "Daniel Sinclair has been asking questions, gathering evidence, making connections that threaten the entire operation. This afternoon's activities particularly concern me." Sheriff Morrison leaned forward. "What activities?" He visited the Prospector Holloway, then spent considerable time at the Meller cabin before returning to town. "My sources indicate he was looking for evidence of foul play in the old man's death." Catherine's heart hammered as she realized how closely they had been watched. If Whitmore had sources tracking Daniel's movements, then Tom Bradley might have walked into a trap when he returned to town to find him. "Did he find anything?" the banker asked nervously. "Unknown, but the risk of discovery increases with every day we delay final action." Whitmore opened her leather journal and consulted her notes. "I've prepared contingency plans for several scenarios, but they all require immediate implementation." Sheriff Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable. "Margaret, when we agreed to cooperate with your people, the understanding was that this would be a business arrangement. Property acquisition, some pressure on reluctant sellers, nothing more. Things have gone much further than originally discussed." Whitmore's smile was sharp as winter ice. "Sheriff, you accepted payment for services rendered. The nature of those services was made clear when you agreed to rule Jonathan Sinclair's death accidental, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. You've been a willing participant from the beginning." "Willing participant in what exactly?" A new voice demanded from the darkness. Catherine spun around to find Daniel Sinclair emerging from the shadows behind her, his face grim with barely controlled anger. Her relief at seeing him alive was instantly replaced by terror at their exposed position. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "they're planning something. We have to—" "I know." His voice was tight with fury. "I've been listening from the other window. Sheriff Morrison helped murder my brother, and now they're planning to eliminate anyone else who might cause problems." The sound of their whispered conversation must have carried because suddenly the office fell silent. Through the window, Catherine could see Whitmore rising from her chair, her pale eyes scanning the darkness. Outside. "We need to leave," Daniel said urgently, taking Catherine's arm. "Now!" They had taken perhaps a dozen steps when the bank's rear door burst open, spilling armed men into the alley. Catherine recognized one of them as a ranch hand she had seen around town, but the others were strangers, hard-faced men with the look of professional gunmen. "Daniel Sinclair," Whitmore called from the doorway, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "How convenient. You've saved us the trouble of hunting you down." Daniel pushed Catherine behind him, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Stay close," he murmured. "When I give the word, run for the church. The pastor will give you sanctuary. I'm not leaving you. Catherine, these people have already killed 3 men to protect their conspiracy. they won't hesitate to kill too. More! Sheriff Morrison stepped into view, his badge catching the lamplight streaming from the bank's interior. Daniel, let's not make this more complicated than necessary. You and Miss Hartwell come inside quietly, and we can discuss this like civilized people. The way you discussed things with my brother? Daniel's voice carried a dangerous edge. The way you discussed things with Henrik Mueller? Morrison's face flushed. Your brother's death was an accident. Mueller died of natural causes. You're seeing conspiracies where none exist. Then explain why Margaret Whitmore is here. Explain why you're meeting secretly with Mountain Development Corporation representatives. Explain why a simple bank president needs hired gunmen for a business meeting. Whitmore stepped forward, apparently deciding subtlety was no longer useful. Mr. Sinclair, you and your brother owned the last significant obstacle to a development project worth millions of dollars to my employers. Jonathan's refusal to sell forced us to seek alternative solutions. Your continued interference forces us to seek permanent solutions. Murder, you mean? Business necessity, Whitmore corrected coolly. Nothing personal. Catherine felt Daniel tense beside her, preparing for action. The alley was narrow, with high walls on both sides, offering little room to maneuver. Their opponents had superior numbers and firepower, but somehow, facing these killers in the darkness, Catherine felt less afraid than she had expected. Perhaps because she finally understood what she was fighting for. Justice for Jonathan, safety for Daniel, and the chance to build something good from the wreckage of the conspiracy. There is one alternative, Whitmore continued, her calculating gaze shifting between Daniel and Catherine. Miss Hartwell could agree to transfer Jonathan's property claims to Mountain Development, sign the necessary documents, and leave the territory quietly. In exchange, Mr. Sinclair lives, and both of you depart with sufficient funds to start over. Elsewhere. And if we refuse, Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer, then you join Jonathan, Mueller, and the others who chose to be obstacles rather than partners. Daniel's hand tightened on his gun. Catherine, whatever you're thinking, don't. These people don't honor agreements. They eliminate witnesses. Very true, Whitmore agreed. But the alternative is immediate elimination rather than the possibility of survival. Choose quickly. My associates grow impatient. Catherine looked at the armed men surrounding them, at the corrupt sheriff who had helped murder innocent people, at the cold-eyed woman who spoke of killing as casually as others discussed the weather. Then she looked at Daniel, who was prepared to die fighting rather than surrender to injustice. Jonathan's wedding ring, hanging on its chain around her neck, seemed to warm against her skin. She thought of the chess game in the parlor, pieces positioned for battle. Some sacrifices were necessary to protect more important pieces, but sometimes the most unlikely piece could change the entire game. I have a counter-proposal, she said, stepping out from behind Daniel despite his urgent whisper of protest. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. You want Jonathan's property. I'm the legal heir according to the marriage contract and territorial law. But I want assurance that Daniel will be allowed to leave safely. Catherine, no, Daniel hissed. Don't trust her. I'm not trusting her, Catherine replied, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. I'm buying time. Whitmore smiled, recognizing a fellow strategist. Time for what, Miss Hartwell? Time for your employers to realize they've made a serious miscalculation. Catherine reached into her pocket, withdrawing a folded document. This afternoon, while you were having us followed, we managed to contact Judge William Harrison in Butte. This is a copy of the detailed report we sent him, documenting the entire conspiracy, including your involvement and that of your local associates. The smile faded from Whitmore's face. You're bluffing. Federal marshals should be arriving in Millbrook Valley within the next few hours, Catherine continued. Probably sooner, since we also managed to send word about the immediate threat to Daniel's life. Judge Harrison takes a dim view of murder, conspiracies, particularly those involving the intimidation of mail-order brides. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his face pale in the lamplight. "Margaret, if federal authorities are involved—" "She's lying," Whitmore said flatly, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "There wasn't time to contact anyone in Butte." "Jake Holloway has friends in many places," Daniel said, picking up Catherine's bluff, "including some who owe him significant favors from the mining boom days. Word travels fast when the right people are motivated." For the first time since Catherine had encountered her, Margaret Whitmore looked genuinely unsettled. She glanced around the alley, as if expecting federal marshals to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "Even if that's true," she said finally, "it changes nothing immediate. You're still outnumbered and outgunned. Federal marshals can't help you if you're dead. But they can avenge us," Catherine replied, "and they can ensure that everyone involved in this conspiracy faces justice, including your employers back east." "Is this land grab really worth that kind of federal attention?" The standoff stretched taut as a violin string. 5 armed men and 2 women and a corrupt sheriff, all waiting to see who would make the first move. Catherine could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool night air, but she kept her expression calm and confident. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came the sound of approaching horses. Many horses, moving fast through the town's quiet streets. Whitmore's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes widening as she realized the implications. Either Catherine had been telling the truth about federal marshals, or Tom Bradley had managed to return with significant reinforcements. Either way, the balance of power was about to shift dramatically. "Boss," one of the gunmen said nervously, "maybe we should—" His words were cut off by the crack of rifle fire from a rooftop across the street. One of Whitmore's men spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. More shots followed, and suddenly the narrow alley erupted in chaos as armed figures appeared at both ends, trapping the conspirators in a crossfire. "Federal marshals!" a voice shouted from the darkness. "Drop your weapons and surrender!" But Margaret Whitmore was already moving, her derringer appearing in her hand with practiced speed. Catherine saw the weapon swing toward Daniel and acted without thinking, throwing herself forward to knock his gun arm aside just as Whitmore fired. The bullet intended for Daniel's heart struck Catherine in the shoulder instead, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the alley wall. Through a haze of pain and shock, she saw Daniel's pistol clear leather, saw the muzzle flash as he returned fire, saw Whitmore stagger backward with blood spreading across her expensive dress. Then, strong hands were lifting Catherine, and Daniel's voice was calling her name with desperate urgency. And the last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the warm weight of Jonathan's ring against her chest and the knowledge that justice, finally, was at hand. Pain dragged Catherine back to consciousness like claws pulling her from deep water. The first sensation was fire radiating from her left shoulder, followed by the awareness that she was lying on something soft, a bed, she realized, though not her own at the inn. Voices filtered through the haze of laudanum and agony, familiar but distorted by her confused state. "Lucky the bullet passed clean through," someone was saying in measured tones. "No major arteries damaged, though she's lost considerable blood. The next 24 hours will be critical. Doc Peterson, you're certain she'll recover?" Daniel's voice tight with worry and something else. Guilt, perhaps. The physical wound should heal well enough, barring infection. But Miss Hartwell has been through considerable trauma. The body can recover from gunshot wounds. The mind sometimes takes longer to mend. Catherine tried to speak, to reassure Daniel that she was stronger than the doctor assumed, but only a weak sound emerged from her throat. Immediately she felt a cool hand on her forehead and heard Daniel's voice much closer. "Catherine, can you hear me?" She managed to open her eyes, squinting against lamplight that seemed impossibly bright. Daniel's face appeared above her, lined with exhaustion and relief. Behind him stood Dr. Peterson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and capable hands, checking her pulse with professional concern. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rose McKenna's house," Daniel explained gently. "We couldn't risk taking you to the inn or the doctor's office. Too many people involved in the conspiracy might try to finish what Whitmore started." Memory flooded back in painful waves. The alley behind the bank, Whitmore's gun swinging toward Daniel, the burning impact of the bullet, the sound of gunfire erupting around them. Catherine struggled to sit up, ignoring the protest from her wounded shoulder. "Whitmore, is she dead?" Daniel said quietly, "along with 2 of her hired guns. Sheriff Morrison and the bank president are in custody, along with the surviving gunman." "The federal marshals actually came?" Daniel's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Under different circumstances. Tom Bradley returned with half the territorial militia. Turns out Jake Holloway's message reached Judge Harrison, and the judge took immediate action. Federal marshals, territorial rangers, and every honest lawman within 50 miles descended on Millbrook Valley like the wrath of God." Dr. Peterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "I need to change Miss Hartwell's dressing and check for signs of infection. Perhaps you could give us some privacy, Mr. Sinclair." Daniel hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Catherine's side. She managed to squeeze his hand with her good arm. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "Go get some rest." "You look terrible." After Daniel left, Dr. Peterson worked efficiently to clean and rebandage Catherine's wound. The process was excruciating despite the laudanum, but she gritted her teeth and endured it, determined not to show weakness when so many people were depending on her recovery. "Miss Hartwell," the doctor said as he finished his work, "I feel I owe you an apology. When Sheriff Morrison asked me to examine Henrik Mueller's body, I found evidence that suggested poisoning rather than natural causes. But Morrison pressured me to rule it a natural death, and I was cowardly. I convinced myself the evidence was inconclusive rather than stand up to authority." Catherine studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "What kind of evidence?" "Symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. A bitter almond smell that shouldn't have been present. But Morrison suggested that contradicting his initial assessment would bring unwanted attention to my practice, perhaps even accusations of incompetence." Peterson's voice was heavy with shame. "After Jonathan Sinclair's death was ruled accidental, I began to suspect a pattern, but I was too frightened to speak out." "You're speaking out now," Catherine pointed out gently, "because a brave woman from Philadelphia showed me what courage looks like," Peterson replied. "You risked your life to expose the truth. The least I can do is ensure that truth is properly documented in my medical reports." Over the following days, as Catherine slowly regained her strength, a steady stream of visitors brought news of the conspiracy's unraveling. Judge Harrison had arrived with federal marshals and immediately begun a comprehensive investigation. The Mountain Development Corporation's records were seized, revealing a web of corruption that extended far beyond Millbrook Valley. Tom Bradley visited on the second day, his weathered face showing relief at seeing Catherine sitting up and taking solid food. "The whole territory's talking about what happened here," he reported. "Turns out Mountain Development was operating similar schemes in 3 other counties, using intimidation and murder to acquire valuable land for Eastern investors. You and Daniel broke open the biggest corruption case Montana Territory has seen. What about the surviving conspirators?" "Bank President Turner is cooperating fully, hoping to avoid the gallows. He's provided evidence about how the money flowed from Eastern investors through dummy corporations to pay for the land acquisitions and the hired guns. Sheriff Morrison is claiming he was coerced, but the evidence suggests he was a willing participant from the beginning." Rose McKenna, who had been Catherine's devoted nurse throughout her recovery, brought more personal news on the 3rd day. "Daniel's been sleeping in the barn. she said with maternal disapproval. Claims the house reminds him too much of Jonathan, but I think he's punishing himself for letting you get shot. That's ridiculous. I chose to throw myself in front of that bullet. Try telling him that. Man's got guilt written all over his face, walking around like he's personally responsible for every bad thing that's happened since his brother died. Catherine made a decision. Help me get dressed. I need to talk to him. Miss Catherine, you're barely strong enough to sit up without assistance. Then you'll have to assist me. But I'm not lying in this bed while Daniel tortures himself with misplaced guilt. Despite Rose's protests, Catherine managed to dress herself in a simple day dress that accommodated the bulk of her bandages. Walking to the barn required considerable determination, but the sight of Daniel's surprised face when she appeared in the doorway made the effort worthwhile. He was grooming one of the horses, working with the methodical precision of someone using physical activity to avoid thinking. When he looked up and saw her standing there, pale but determined, the brush fell from his hand. "Catherine, what are you doing out of bed? Dr. Peterson said you need complete rest. I need to talk to you more than I need rest." She moved carefully to a hay bale and sat down, trying not to wince at the movement. "Rose tells me you've been avoiding the house." Daniel resumed brushing the horse with unnecessary vigor. "I've been busy with the mill, dealing with investigators, settling Jonathan's affairs." "You've been hiding," Catherine corrected gently. "From me, from the house, from the fact that your brother is gone and you're still alive." His hands stilled on the brush. "I should have protected him better. I should have seen what was happening, should have acted sooner." Jonathan was investigating the conspiracy for weeks before his death. If he couldn't prevent what happened to him, how could you have? Because I'm supposed to be the careful one, the one who sees dangers before they become fatal. Jonathan was the dreamer who saw the best in everyone. I was supposed to watch out for the worst. Catherine stood up slowly, moving closer to where Daniel stood with his back to her. "And what about me? Was I supposed to watch out for the worst when I threw myself in front of Whitmore's gun?" Daniel turned to face her. His dark eyes filled with pain. "That was different. You were protecting me, the same way you've been trying to protect everyone since your brother died. The same way Jonathan would have protected me if he'd had the chance." Catherine reached out and touched his arm with her good hand. "Daniel, you can't carry the weight of everyone's safety on your shoulders. Sometimes bad things happen, despite our best efforts to prevent them. But if I had acted sooner, been more suspicious of Morrison, paid more attention to the pattern of deaths, then you might have ended up dead beside your brother, and Margaret Whitmore would have succeeded in eliminating all opposition to the conspiracy." Catherine moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion and grief etched in every line of his face. "Jonathan trusted you with his most precious possession, his plans for our future together. He asked you to honor his commitment to me because he knew you would do everything in your power to protect what mattered to him." Daniel's expression cracked, revealing the raw grief he had been holding back since his brother's death. "I miss him so much, Catherine. We shared everything from the moment we were born. I don't know how to exist in a world where he isn't." "You don't have to learn that alone," Catherine said softly. "Jonathan brought us together, even if not in the way he originally planned. Maybe that's his legacy, not the property or the mill, but the connection between two people who cared about him enough to risk everything for justice." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine could see him wrestling with emotions he wasn't sure how to express. Finally, he spoke. "When I saw Whitmore's gun aimed at you, when I realized you had put yourself in danger to save my life, I understood something Jonathan knew months ago." "What's that?" "That you're extraordinary, Catherine Hartwell. Brave and intelligent and determined in ways that shame men who think courage is only displayed on battlefields." Daniel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I understood that my brother fell in love with exactly the right woman." The words hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Catherine felt her heart beating faster, though whether from emotion or the lingering effects of blood loss, she couldn't say. "Daniel, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you came here expecting to marry Jonathan, not his brother. I know you need time to heal, time to decide what you want from life, now that everything has changed. What I want," Catherine said carefully, "is to honor the commitment I made when I left Philadelphia. I came west to build a life with a good man, to create something meaningful from the courage it took to leave everything familiar behind." Daniel's expression grew guarded. And I've discovered that the man Jonathan described in his letters, kind, intelligent, dedicated to protecting the people he cares about, that man is very much alive. He just happens to be standing in front of me instead of waiting at the altar. The hope that flickered in Daniel's eyes was almost painful to witness. "Catherine, are you saying—" "I'm saying that when Dr. Peterson declares me fully recovered, and when we've settled the legal questions about the property and Jonathan's estate, I would be honored to fulfill the marriage contract with the Sinclair brother who survived to see it through." Daniel closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "Are you certain? This isn't gratitude or sympathy or—" Catherine silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft and careful, mindful of her injury, but it conveyed everything she couldn't yet put into words. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "That didn't feel like gratitude," Daniel murmured against her forehead. "Good, because what I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice." Their moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Daniel immediately tensed, his protective instincts flaring despite the conspiracy's apparent resolution. Through the barn's open door, they could see several horsemen approaching Rose McKenna's house at considerable speed. "More investigators?" Catherine asked, though something about the riders' urgency suggested otherwise. Daniel helped her move to the door, where they could observe without being easily seen. The lead rider was Tom Bradley, but his expression carried none of the relief Catherine had seen during his previous visits. Behind him rode Jake Holloway, and 2 men Catherine didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional trackers. Bradley dismounted and strode toward the house with obvious urgency. Rose appeared on the front porch before he could knock, her face creased with concern. "Tom, what's happened? We need to find Miss Catherine and Daniel immediately. 3 of Whitmore's associates escaped from the jail transport to Helena last night. Federal marshals think they're heading back here to settle scores before fleeing the territory." Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. "How many associates?" 3 that we know of. Professional killers who weren't in town during the original. Arrests. They've been hunting the marshals who captured their partners, eliminating witnesses to the conspiracy. Bradley's expression was grim. "One of them is Whitmore's brother, Samuel. According to the prisoners who are talking, he's even more dangerous than she was." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "How long do we have?" "Maybe hours, maybe less. These men know the territory, and they have local contacts who haven't been identified yet." Holloway spoke for the first time. "We need to get you both to safety while the marshals set up a proper defense." Catherine looked around the peaceful valley that had become her battlefield, then at Daniel's face, seeing the same determination that had driven him to investigate his brother's murder despite the danger. They had survived one deadly conspiracy, exposed corruption that reached from Montana Territory to eastern boardrooms, and found love in the midst of violence and loss. Now, wounded and exhausted, they faced a final test of their courage and their commitment to each other. The mail-order bride who had arrived seeking security was about to discover whether the strength she had found within herself was enough to survive one last confrontation with the forces that had already taken so much from both of them. "Where can we go that these men can't follow?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her chest. Holloway smiled grimly. I know places in these mountains that even Apache scouts never found. But the journey will be hard, especially for someone with a fresh gunshot wound. Then we better get started, Catherine replied, already mentally preparing for another flight into the wilderness. I didn't survive Margaret Whitmore just to be murdered by her brother. As they prepared for what might be their final escape, Catherine felt Jonathan's ring warm against her chest and thought of the chess game in the parlor that had become such a powerful metaphor for her journey. The game wasn't over yet, but she was no longer a pawn waiting to be moved by others' strategies. She had become a player in her own right, ready to make whatever moves were necessary to protect the future she and Daniel were building from the ashes of tragedy. The hidden cave system Jake Holloway led them to was a natural fortress carved into the mountainside by centuries of flowing water. Located 3 hours' hard ride from Millbrook Valley, it offered multiple escape routes and defensive positions that would be difficult for attackers to assault without significant losses. Catherine's shoulder throbbed with every movement of her horse during the ascent, but she gritted her teeth and endured the pain without complaint. Lives depended on reaching safety before Samuel Whitmore and his associates could track them down. As they settled into the main chamber of the cave system, Bradley and Holloway worked to establish defensive positions while Daniel helped Catherine arrange a makeshift bed from their limited supplies. The cave was surprisingly spacious, with several branching tunnels that led deeper into the mountain. Ancient paintings on the walls suggested it had served as shelter for countless generations before them. How long can we stay here? Catherine asked, accepting a cup of coffee from a small fire they had built near the cave entrance. As long as necessary, Holloway replied, checking his rifle. I've got supplies cached throughout these mountains: food, ammunition, medical supplies. Samuel Whitmore might be a professional killer, but I've been living in this wilderness for 30 years. Daniel sat beside Catherine, his expression troubled. Jake, you said these men had local contacts who haven't been identified. Any idea who might still be helping them? Could be anyone, Bradley said grimly. The conspiracy reached deeper into the community than we realized. Bank clerks, storekeepers, ranch hands, anyone who was receiving payments to keep their mouths shut might feel obligated to help Whitmore's associates. The first indication they were being hunted came at dawn on the second day. Catherine woke to find Daniel and the other men crouched at the cave entrance, studying the valley below through field glasses. In the distance, she could see 3 riders moving systematically across the landscape, following what appeared to be a deliberate search pattern. They're tracking us, Holloway said quietly. Professional job, too. They know we came in this direction, and they're checking every possible hiding place. Catherine joined them at the entrance, noting how the riders moved with military precision. Each man carried multiple weapons and seemed comfortable with the mountain terrain. These weren't opportunistic criminals seeking easy revenge. They were methodical hunters who wouldn't give up until they found their prey. How long before they reached this area, she asked. 6 hours, maybe less, Daniel replied. They're moving faster than I expected. Bradley lowered his field glasses with a troubled expression. There's something else. See that 4th rider hanging back? He's not searching, he's observing, making sure nobody escapes while the others close in. Catherine felt her blood chill as she recognized the tactical sophistication of their pursuers. They're not just hunting us, they're herding us toward something. Holloway nodded grimly. Classic military technique. Force your enemy into a position where their options are limited, then close the trap. Question is, what trap are they driving us toward? Their answer came sooner than expected. A shot echoed through the mountains, followed by another. Then the sustained crackle of rifle fire from multiple directions. Catherine could see muzzle flashes from positions that seemed to surround their hiding place on 3 sides. They found us, Daniel said, already moving toward their gear. We need to use the back tunnels. But as they gathered their supplies, more shots rang out from behind them, from the direction of their planned escape route. Holloway's face went pale as he realized the implications. They've got the rear entrance covered too. Someone told them about this cave system. The betrayal hit Catherine like a physical blow. After everything they had endured, someone they trusted had sold them out to their enemies. But there was no time to process the emotional impact of treachery. Bullets were already ricocheting off the cave walls as their attackers moved closer. "The upper tunnels," Holloway said urgently. "There's a passage that leads to an opening high on the cliff face. Dangerous climb, but it's our only option." They moved deeper into the cave system, following passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. Catherine's wounded shoulder screamed with every movement, but she forced herself to keep pace with the others. Behind them, the sound of pursuit echoed through the stone corridors, voices calling instructions, boots scraping against rock, the occasional rifle shot when someone thought they glimpsed movement. The upper passage, Holloway had mentioned, proved to be a nightmare of loose rock and narrow ledges. Catherine found herself crawling through spaces barely wide enough for her body, her dress tearing on jagged stone, her breathing labored from exertion and fear. At one point, the passage opened onto a ledge that offered a stomach-churning view of the valley floor hundreds of feet below. "There," Holloway whispered, pointing to what appeared to be solid rock. "Hidden entrance behind that outcropping, but we'll be exposed crossing the ledge." They had no choice. One by one, they made the terrifying traverse across the narrow ledge, pressed against the cliff face, while loose stones cascaded into the void below. Catherine closed her eyes and focused on placing each step carefully, trusting Daniel's steadying hand on her good arm. They had almost reached safety when a voice called out from below, "Miss Catherine Hartwell." The voice carried clearly in the mountain air, cultured and controlled despite the circumstances. Catherine recognized the accent immediately, educated Eastern, like Margaret Whitmore's, but with a masculine authority that made her skin crawl. "I am Samuel Whitmore," the voice continued. "I believe you and your associates killed my sister." Daniel helped Catherine into the concealed opening behind the outcropping, then turned to face the valley below. "Your sister was a murderer," he called back. "She killed innocent people for money. My sister was a businesswoman who understood that sometimes obstacles must be removed to achieve progress. You and your brother were obstacles." Catherine peered over the edge of their hiding place and saw Samuel Whitmore standing on a rocky prominence about 200 feet below. He was a tall, lean man in expensive clothing that seemed incongruous with the wild mountain setting. Unlike his sister's cold calculation, his demeanor suggested barely controlled rage. "Your brother Jonathan was particularly troublesome," Whitmore continued, "always asking questions, always poking into affairs that didn't concern him. Margaret had to make an example of him to discourage similar behavior from others. Jonathan was trying to protect innocent people from your conspiracy," Catherine called down, her voice carrying further than she had intended. Whitmore's head turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the cliff face above him. "Ah, Miss Hartwell, the mail-order bride who caused so much trouble. My sister was quite impressed by your resourcefulness, though ultimately it wasn't enough to save her life." "She saved mine," Daniel said firmly, "and she helped expose the corruption that was poisoning this valley." "Corruption?" Whitmore laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "We brought progress to this backward territory. Investment, development, modernization. The people we removed were standing in the way of economic advancement that would have benefited hundreds of families." Catherine felt anger overwhelming her fear. "You murdered Henrik Müller. You had Jonathan killed. You destroyed lives for profit." "I destroyed obstacles for progress," Whitmore corrected. "Müller was a stubborn old fool who refused generous compensation for worthless land. Your intended husband was an idealistic dreamer who couldn't understand business necessities. Both chose to be problems rather than partners in development. The callous dismissal of human life ignited something fierce in Catherine's chest. They chose to have principles, something you and your sister clearly never understood. Principles don't build railroads, Miss Hartwell. Principles don't create jobs or bring prosperity to isolated communities. Sometimes harsh decisions must be made for the greater good. Whose greater good? Daniel demanded. Your Eastern investors' bank accounts. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. My investors represented legitimate business interests seeking to develop valuable resources. Your brother's interference threatened millions of dollars in planned improvements, so you had him murdered. I had an obstacle removed, Whitmore said coldly. Just as I'm about to remove the remaining obstacles to this project's completion. The threat was clear, but Catherine noticed something in Whitmore's positioning that gave her hope. He was standing in the open, focused entirely on their conversation, apparently confident that his associates had them trapped. But Jake Holloway had been moving steadily through the shadows during the exchange, working his way to a position that offered a clear shot at their tormentor. "Mr. Whitmore," Catherine called out, buying Holloway more time to position himself. "What makes you think killing us will solve your problems? The federal investigation has already exposed your entire operation. Federal investigations can be influenced by the right political pressure. Witnesses can be discredited or eliminated. Evidence can disappear when the proper incentives are applied." Whitmore's smile was visible even at this distance. "My family has considerable influence in Washington, Miss Hartwell. This temporary setback will be resolved quietly." "You're forgetting something," Daniel said. "Judge Harrison has testimony from dozens of witnesses, documentation of every illegal transaction, confessions from your sister's surviving associates, all of which becomes meaningless if the key witnesses suffer unfortunate accidents during their escape from justice." Whitmore gestured to his hidden associates. "Mountain climbing is dangerous, Miss Hartwell. Tragic accidents occur regularly in terrain like this." The casual mention of their planned deaths finally pushed Catherine beyond fear into cold determination. These people had taken Jonathan from her before she could even meet him. They had wounded her, threatened Daniel, and corrupted an entire community with their greed. Enough was enough. "Mr. Whitmore," she called down, her voice carrying a new edge. "There's something you should know about obstacles." "What's that?" "Sometimes they fight back." The crack of Holloway's rifle echoed through the mountains like thunder. Samuel Whitmore spun and fell, clutching his leg as blood spread across his expensive trousers. His cry of pain and surprise was followed immediately by shouts from his associates and the rapid fire of multiple weapons. But Holloway's shot had been the signal for a coordinated response. Bradley opened fire from a concealed position on the opposite cliff face, forcing Whitmore's men to take cover. Daniel added his rifle to the barrage, targeting anyone who tried to reach their wounded leader. "Catherine," Daniel said urgently, not taking his eyes off the battle below, "there's a rope cached in the back of this cave. We need to use it to reach the next ledge up. This position will be overrun once they organize a proper assault." Catherine found the rope and helped secure it while the gun battle raged below. The sound of ricocheting bullets and shouted orders created a deafening chaos that seemed to fill the entire mountain. Through it all, she could hear Samuel Whitmore's voice, alternately cursing his associates and calling out increasingly desperate threats. "You can't escape," he yelled. "Even if you kill all of us, there are others who will continue this work. The development of this territory won't be stopped by a few idealistic fools." "Maybe not," Catherine called back as she prepared to climb to the higher ledge. "But it'll be stopped by federal marshals, honest judges, and people who believe in justice over profit." The climb to the upper ledge was terrifying, but it offered something their previous position had lacked, a clear view of the entire battlefield. From this vantage point, Catherine could see that Whitmore's tactical situation was far worse than he realized. Federal marshals were approaching from two directions, having followed the sound of gunfire to its source. The killers who thought they had trapped their prey were about to become trapped themselves. "Daniel," she called softly, pointing toward the approaching lawman. "Look." Daniel followed her gaze and smiled grimly. "Marshal Hayes and his men. Samuel Whitmore is about to discover that federal authorities don't give up as easily as corrupt local officials." The end came swiftly. Faced with superior numbers and caught in crossfire from multiple directions, Whitmore's associates surrendered rather than fight to the death. Samuel Whitmore himself, wounded and trapped on his rocky prominence, had no choice but to accept capture or die in a hopeless last stand. Catherine watched as federal marshals secured the prisoners and began the careful process of documenting evidence of the final conspiracy. From her perch high above the valley floor, she could see the end of a nightmare that had begun with a sabotaged chain in a lumber mill and had nearly cost her everything she had come west to find. "It's over," Daniel said quietly, sitting beside her on the narrow ledge. "Really over this time." Catherine nodded, feeling exhaustion replace the adrenaline that had sustained her through another deadly confrontation. "Jonathan can rest in peace. Now, his killers will face justice." "All of them," Daniel agreed, "including the man who ordered his death." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the marshals work below and waiting for the all-clear signal that would allow them to descend safely. The ordeal that had begun with Catherine's arrival in Millbrook Valley was finally reaching its conclusion. Justice would be served, corruption would be exposed, and the people responsible for so much suffering would face the consequences of their actions. But more than that, Catherine realized, as she felt Daniel's hand slip into hers. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for when she left Philadelphia. Not just a husband to honor a contract with, but a partner who shared her values and her determination to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The mail-order bride who had arrived to find her groom dead had discovered something far more valuable than the security she had originally sought. She had found love born of shared danger and mutual respect, forged in the crucible of violence and strengthened by their willingness to risk everything for justice. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine and Daniel prepared to descend from their eyrie and begin the next chapter of their lives together. The conspiracy that had brought them together was ended, but the future they would build from its ashes was just beginning. 6 months after Samuel Whitmore's capture, spring had returned to Millbrook Valley with a vibrancy that seemed to echo the community's renewal. The corruption that had poisoned the town for years was gone. Federal oversight had ensured honest elections, and new families were arriving weekly, drawn by the promise of fair dealings and legitimate opportunities. Catherine stood at the window of what had once been Jonathan's house and was now hers and Daniel's, watching the transformation with deep satisfaction. The house itself had undergone its own metamorphosis. The masculine furnishings Jonathan had chosen with such care remained, but Catherine had added her own touches. Lace curtains at the windows, a flower garden blooming where the vegetable patch had been, and a small library alcove where she could prepare lessons for the expanded school she now ran. The chess set still occupied its place of honor in the parlor, though now it served as a reminder of strategy overcome, rather than battles yet to be fought. The judge's carriage just turned. "Onto Elm Street," Daniel called from the kitchen, where he was helping Rose McKenna prepare for their afternoon guests. "Federal Marshal Hayes is with him, and it looks like they've brought someone else." Catherine smoothed her best dress, pale green silk that complemented her auburn hair, and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Today's visitors were arriving for the formal conclusion of legal proceedings that had consumed much of the winter. Judge Harrison had promised to deliver final verdicts on the remaining conspirators, and Marshal Hayes was providing an update on the broader investigation that had spread to 3 other territories. The knock at the front door came precisely at 2 o'clock, and Catherine opened it to find Judge Harrison removing his hat with judicial formality. Behind him stood Marshal Hayes and a distinguished woman Catherine didn't recognize, elderly, expensively dressed, with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything they saw. "Miss Catherine Sinclair," Judge Harrison said with a slight smile. Catherine still felt a thrill at hearing her married name, though she and Daniel had been wed for 3 months now. "May I present Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, mother of Samuel and Margaret Whitmore." Catherine's composure faltered momentarily. The last thing she had expected was a visit from the mother of the people who had tried to kill her. But Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward with surprising dignity, extending a gloved hand. "Mrs. Sinclair, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I've come a long way to meet the woman who brought my children's crimes to light." Daniel appeared at Catherine's shoulder, his protective instincts immediately alert. But Mrs. Whitmore's manner was neither threatening nor hostile. If anything, she seemed deeply weary. "Please, come in," Catherine said, her natural courtesy overcoming her apprehension. "We were just preparing tea." In the parlor, seated around the chess table that had witnessed so many significant conversations, Judge Harrison began with his official business. Samuel Whitmore had been sentenced to life imprisonment, avoiding the gallows only because his cooperation had helped uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. The surviving associates faced various sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Most importantly, the federal investigation had traced the corruption to its eastern sources, resulting in arrests of prominent investors and political figures whose influence had protected the scheme for years. The Mountain Development Corporation was dissolved, and all its assets have been returned to the original landowners or their estates, Judge Harrison reported. The financial damages were substantial, but justice has been served. Marshal Hayes added his own update. Similar operations in Colorado and Wyoming territories have been shut down based on evidence gathered here. In total, more than 40 people have been arrested, and millions of dollars in fraudulent land transactions have been reversed. Catherine felt a deep sense of vindication, knowing that Jonathan's death had not been in vain. But her attention was drawn to Mrs. Whitmore, who had remained silent throughout the official presentations, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "Mrs. Whitmore," Catherine said gently, "may I ask why you felt compelled to make this journey? It must have been difficult, considering—" The older woman looked up with eyes that held decades of pain and disappointment. "Mrs. Sinclair, I came to apologize. Not for my children's crimes. No apology could be sufficient for that, but for my failure as a mother to instill in them the values that might have prevented such tragedy." Daniel leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Whitmore sighed deeply before answering. "My husband built a business empire through ruthless practices that I chose to ignore because they provided comfort and social standing. My children grew up believing that success justified any methods, that people were obstacles to be removed rather than fellow human beings deserving of respect." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a thick envelope. "When I learned the full extent of what Samuel and Margaret had done, I realized that their actions were the inevitable result of values I had helped instill. This envelope contains a bank draft for $50,000, compensation for the suffering they caused you, Mr. Daniel Sinclair, and the families of all their victims." Catherine was stunned by the magnitude of the offer. $50,000 represented more money than most families in the territory would see in a lifetime. "Mrs. Whitmore, that's incredibly generous, but we can't accept." "You can, and you will," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted firmly. "Not as charity, but as restitution. My children destroyed lives and corrupted an entire community. The money cannot undo that damage, but it can perhaps help build something better from the ruins." Judge Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Whitmore has already established a victim compensation fund with federal oversight. The money will be distributed fairly among all those who suffered losses due to the conspiracy." "There's more," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "I'm liquidating my remaining assets to establish an educational foundation. Schools, libraries, teacher training programs for frontier communities. Margaret and Samuel used education as a weapon to manipulate and control. I want to ensure their victims' children have access to learning that opens minds rather than corrupting them." Catherine felt tears threatening as she recognized the profound grief and determination in the older woman's voice. "That's a beautiful legacy to create from such a tragedy. It's the only meaningful response I can make to the horrors my family perpetrated." Mrs. Whitmore's voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "Mrs. Sinclair, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How did you find the courage to act as you did? Most people would have fled at the first sign of danger, yet you chose to stay and fight for justice. What gave you that strength?" Catherine considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself many times during the long winter months of legal proceedings and recovery. "I think it was the realization that running away wouldn't honor Jonathan's memory or protect other innocent people from suffering as he did. At some point, we all have to decide what we're willing to stand up for, regardless of the personal cost." Daniel reached over and took her hand. Catherine had more courage than anyone in Millbrook Valley, including me. She saw what needed to be done and did it, even when it meant risking her life. Mrs. Whitmore nodded approvingly. "That's true heroism, acting not from fearlessness, but despite fear. I wish my children had learned that lesson." The conversation continued for another hour, covering the details of the educational foundation and the compensation fund. As the afternoon light began to fade, Judge Harrison and Marshal Hayes prepared to depart for Helena, their official business complete. Mrs. Whitmore lingered, seeming reluctant to leave despite having accomplished her stated purpose. Finally, she addressed Catherine directly. "Mrs. Sinclair, I have one final request. When the school you mentioned begins operating with foundation support, would you consider establishing a memorial scholarship in Jonathan Sinclair's name? He died trying to protect his community from my children's greed. Perhaps some good can come from remembering his sacrifice." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Catherine replied, moved by the unexpected compassion in the request. "Jonathan would be honored to know his memory was helping other young people pursue education and opportunity." After their guests departed, Catherine and Daniel walked through their property as evening settled over the valley. The mill was operating again under Daniel's management, providing jobs for dozens of families. The town was growing steadily but responsibly, with federal oversight ensuring that development proceeded fairly. Most importantly, the fear that had gripped Millbrook Valley for years was finally lifting. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked, as they paused beside the creek that had made this land so valuable. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming into all this danger and uncertainty?" Catherine considered the question. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 6 months ago had been seeking security and conventional happiness. What she had found instead was love, born of shared trials, purpose derived from fighting for justice, and a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she said finally, "I came west looking for one kind of life and found something entirely different, something better, even though it came at a terrible cost." "Jonathan would be proud of how everything turned out," Daniel said softly. "You honored his dreams in ways he never could have imagined." Catherine touched the wedding ring Daniel had placed on her finger 3 months earlier, a simple gold band that perfectly complemented Jonathan's ring, which she now wore on a chain around her neck. Two brothers, two rings, one continuing love story that had been transformed but not destroyed by tragedy. "I think he would be proud of you too," she replied. "You kept every promise you made to him, and you built something lasting from the wreckage of the conspiracy." They stood together in the gathering twilight, listening to the sound of water flowing over stones and watching lights begin to flicker on in the houses scattered throughout the valley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The mill was expanding, the school needed additional teachers, and the growing community required constant attention to ensure it developed along honest lines. But for now, Catherine was content to stand beside the man she had chosen in the place she had claimed as home, surrounded by evidence that sometimes courage and determination could triumph over greed and corruption. The mail-order bride, who had arrived to find her intended groom dead, had become something she never could have imagined. A woman who had helped save an entire community and found love deeper than anything promised in letters. A year later, Catherine stood before 30 eager students in the new Millbrook Valley Academy, teaching mathematics with the same passion she had once brought to her sewing work in Philadelphia. The classroom was bright and spacious, funded by the Whitmore Educational Foundation and equipped with the finest materials available. Among her students were children from the original families who had survived the conspiracy's reign of terror, newcomers drawn by the valley's honest prosperity, and even a few orphans whose parents had fallen victim to the corruption. All were learning together, preparing for futures that would be built on education and opportunity rather than fear and exploitation. During the lunch break, Catherine stepped outside to find Daniel waiting with a picnic basket and news from town. "Marshal, Hayes sent word from Helena," he reported as they settled under an oak tree that overlooked both the school and their home. "The last of the Eastern conspirators was sentenced this morning. 20 years in federal prison. So it's truly finished. Now," Catherine mused, "all of them facing justice." "All of them," Daniel confirmed. "And the territorial governor has announced that Millbrook Valley will be held up as an example of how communities can recover from corruption through honest leadership and citizen involvement." Catherine smiled at the recognition, though she knew the real victory lay not in official acknowledgement, but in the daily reality of a community that had learned to protect itself from those who would exploit it. "There's something else," Daniel said, his expression growing serious. "Dr. Peterson confirmed what we suspected. We're going to have a child." Catherine had known for weeks, but hearing Daniel say the words aloud made the future suddenly real in ways she hadn't anticipated. Their child would grow up in a world shaped by the courage their parents had shown, inheriting not just property and prosperity, but the knowledge that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary evil and prevail. Jonathan would have loved being an uncle, she said softly, one hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "He would have," Daniel agreed, "and our child will grow up knowing the uncle who died protecting the values we want to pass on." As they finished their lunch and prepared to return to their respective work, Catherine to her students, Daniel to the mill that was becoming the economic foundation for the valley's continued growth, Catherine reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Philadelphia seeking security and found adventure. She had come west to marry one man and married his brother instead. She had expected to become a conventional frontier wife and instead became an educator and community leader. Most importantly, she had discovered that the courage to do what was right could emerge from the most unlikely sources when circumstances demanded it. The mail-order bride who had arrived to find her groom dead had become something far more valuable. A woman who had helped save a community and built a future worthy of the sacrifices made to secure it. As she walked back toward the school, Catherine carried with her not just the promise of new life growing within her, but the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most meaningful destinations. The chess game in the parlor at home remained set up as she and Daniel had left it after their last match, a friendly competition between equals that would continue throughout their lives together. But the more dangerous game, the one that had threatened everything they valued, was finally over. Justice had prevailed, love had triumphed over fear, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard, and Catherine smiled as she prepared to teach the next generation the lessons that mattered most, that courage could emerge from ordinary people, that justice was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most beautiful lives grew from the ashes of tragedy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.